So welcome to all of you. I can't wait to come back to Brazil, or I'm coming back to Brazil for Southern Cone Sol, so maybe I'll see some of you there. And we're going to talk today about the dictionary. This first slide is a big, fat, old dictionary of ours. And there we go. And today's talk is about usage. And I call this mind your manners, because I think that manners are really the that usage is the manners of language. We talk about grammar, we talk about syntax, we talk about vocabulary. We don't often talk about usage, and there's something about usage that's special, because part of what usage is extra linguistic. It's not only about the meaning, the dictionary definition, it's about the way that we use that word in real situations. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And when we say usage in dictionaries, we often mean a warning of some kind. This is our highway warning sign. And usage in a dictionary usually is a warning whether or not this word will be offensive, for example. And we're going to talk about that. But first of all, this word usage is one that has a lot of different meanings itself. So let's clear up that. Usage, if we think about it just in terms of, say, your cell phone or your smartphone, usage could just mean the data, the amount of data that you have left remaining in your plan, for example, or how much data you can download at a given time. So that's one meaning of the word usage. But when linguists use the word usage, they usually mean frequency. And frequency means how often is a word used. For example, how many times per million words is a given word used, and that can give us as linguists a good sense of how common a word is or how frequently it's used. And so, for example, here's the word internet from the Google Books archive. And if you don't know Google Books, it's many millions of books all downloaded, and you can search them. It's kind of fun to search for different words and to see how language changes. In this case, I just used, just to be silly, the word internet. And big surprise, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's no use of the word internet in 1820. But there is, you see after the 1990s, you see that the usage of the word internet becomes much more frequent. So that's what linguists mean by usage, and that is to say frequency. And here's another way of looking at the Google Books. You can look at the way different words are used over time. So, for example, I used the words corset and miniskirt, which are two different fashion terms. And you can see that corset was used very frequently, and it sort of peaked right around after 1910, whereas miniskirt didn't even come into the language until the 1960s. So again, it's a kind of interesting way to measure the frequency, the usage of a word. This is kind of a funny thing to see that sometimes you can use this tool to watch how language changes. So, for example, the word public, like the word music, used to be spelled with a K at the end, CK. And you can see that happening right here. And the blue line represents the fact that public was spelled with a K more frequently than it was spelled without the K until around 1750 or so, 1758. And then you see they switch, and the usage clearly shows that it's more common today to spell public without a K. So it's a fascinating tool for linguists, and you should all, as English teachers, English language lovers, you can use that tool. What's interesting to me about that date where public loses its K, it's just about the time where Noah Webster was born. And of course, Noah Webster was the great lexicographer. He wrote the great first American dictionary, and he's also the person who changed the spelling of American English almost single-handedly. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And when you think about how important a language is and how many people use a language, it's very hard to control a language. Some people think that the dictionary does control a language, but it doesn't. Really, what a dictionary does is report on a language. And what Webster did that was special and different was that he wrote his first dictionary at a moment of cultural change. And that is to say that it was immediately after the American Revolution. And so that the dictionaries or the books that were printed in London were printed in one way with one set of spellings. And then when Webster made his dictionary the first one in 1806, very shortly after the Revolution. The American printers and publishers adopted his spelling. So he chose this moment of cultural disruption to kind of make a declaration of cultural independence. And it's important to remember that he really had two ideas about spelling, and that is to say that he wanted, on the one hand, he wanted spelling to be more logical and more phonetic. And you all know that English spelling is neither logical nor phonetic. But Webster also wanted to have a kind of political declaration of cultural independence to make an American variety of English. I think that Webster succeeded in making an American variety of English because we all recognize these spellings today. And think of what they are. When we drop the U, for example, in words like color and honor and humor, or when we spell words like civilize or civilization with a Z instead of an S, or words like theater and center, when we spell them with an ER at the end instead of an RE at the end. And also other words you might not think of. A word like plow, as in a farmer's plow or a snow plow, we would spell in the United States today as P-L-O-W, not the older spelling of P-L-O-U-G-H. And then there's this other less common thing like public and music that had a K at the end. So all of those changes were the changes that were instituted by Noah Webster. So that's my little aside about Webster and his own changes to the language. But when we talk about usage, getting back to usage, there's another thing to discuss, which is semantics, the meanings of words. How are words used to carry meaning? And of course, this is the most basic function of a dictionary. So for example, a word like childish has kind of negative connotations, and yet a word like childlike has very positive connotations. So semantically, they are similar, but they're important differences between the way these two words are used. One in a kind of negative way, and one in a kind of positive way. And so this is what we're going to start to look at in this talk, is these very subtle differences. For example, we'll take the bottom example first. Words like sensual and sensuous. Semantically, they're very, very close in meaning, but in usage, they occur in different circumstances. So for example, sensual is usually used when referring to something that is physical, like the body. But sensuous is very often used in contexts that are aesthetic or abstract, like works of art. Above, this is an example that you're not responsible for. I just chose these two words that are very, very close in their roots and in their sounds and in their spellings, but mean slightly different things to show you how very complicated English can be. Perspicacious, the top word, perspicacious, means able to perceive. So able to perceive something. But perspicuous means something that is clear and able to be seen through. So they both come from the same Latin roots that you would recognize, I'm sure, through Portuguese. But they end up meaning different things in English. And so this is how usage separates words. So usage is the way in which words or phrases are actually used in a language community. This is the dictionary definition of usage in the linguistic context. And this is really what we're talking about today. And notice it says the way they are actually used, not in some sort of idealized or platonic sealed sense, closed circuit. It means that the way that people actually use the words over time become the way that the words are defined and expressed in the dictionary. And this is the customary use of language. Custom means habit, and really language is a habit. Accents are habits. Grammar is essentially a codified set of linguistic habits. When we talk about grammar, we're talking about something slightly different, and especially for the dictionary, because the dictionary, as you know, really measures vocabulary and it expresses vocabulary more than it expresses grammar. And that's because we're treating words in isolation. That's not a surprise to any of you. Rules of grammar are understood by native speakers by virtue simply of being a native speaker. In other words, we don't consciously think of any of these things. They are habits. And this is an important point. All grammar is usage, but not all usage is grammar. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll show you. Grammar usually refers to structure, and structure means the way that words are connected to each other. Agreement, inflection, conjugation. But usage is often really about word choice, and that's a fairly different thing. So, for example, these are kind of difficulties that native speakers have, and I don't think they're necessarily problems for good fluent speakers of English who have learned English. A lot of times these are problems that are not shared among language groups. But just for the sake of argument, these are problems that many native speakers have with usage. So, for example, just lay or lie the book on the table. Well, this is a question of transitivity, and conventionally we say lay the book on the table, the transitive verb. And then I feel tired and want to lay or lie down. Well, and again, this is conventionally we say to lie down, the intransitive verb. The next one is a usage dispute that people comment on all the time. It's not a very important one, and keep in mind that if you look up these words, you'll see that we give definitions for both uses, but conventionally, the smell of garbage in the alley was nauseating or nauseous. Which one is it? And then the next one is, by the end of the bumpy flight, I was feeling nauseated or nauseous. Well, there's a convention by which the word nauseous or nauseous is something that causes nausea. So that would be the first one. And nauseated is the resulting symptom. And finally, down the next one is also about transitivity. Clouds are composed or comprised of, and then 9 players compose or comprise a baseball team. So again, this is about transitivity for the most part, and what we do see is, I've got to move my screen, clouds are composed of water particles, and 9 players comprise a baseball team. So this is what usage means in the dictionary, getting into these distinctions. And again, some of these distinctions are so subtle that you may never have known that they were controversial. We have an entire dictionary at Merriam-Webster of English usage. It's every bit as big as the regular collegiate dictionary, and it explains all of these conventions, which really is what we're talking about, conventions. Here's a couple more. His words imply or infer a threat, and then from your letter, I imply or infer something. I can't quite see my screen, but that you're, what does it say? That you're sad. And so so again, imply and infer are words that are often confused in English. So his words implied a threat, and from your letter, I inferred. So one kind of projects to outward, and one moves inward. And then the last one is sort of a strange one. Again, just a convention, but conventions are usage. Usage is habit, and usage is manners, and usage is convention. So we hanged or hung a wreath, or the prisoner was hanged or hung at dawn. There is a convention by which this verb has 2 past tenses, which is very strange for an English verb, and we make a distinction between the two. We hung a wreath on the door, and the prisoner was hanged at dawn. So conventionally, hanged is used for executions. And again, there's no logic behind it. It's simply the way it is. And these are things that we can become familiar with as you read and listen to more. But sometimes usage is both grammar and word choice. And in this case, for example, an error or a usage controversy or difficulty that exists in English but doesn't exist in Portuguese, doesn't exist in any Romance language, and in fact would be impossible in most of the languages of the world, which is to confuse the subject with the object. But as you probably already know, in English, it's very possible to substitute the object for the subject, or the subject for the object, when it appears in this position. That is to say, when it appears in the predicate objective position. So I hope that you can come to lunch with Corey and me, and it would be me as the correct object pronoun. Now, most of you already know that, but I bet if you pay attention to American news or politics, every American president in my lifetime has often used I in this exact syntactical circumstance. So you realize that it's possible and even logical for some English speakers to confuse this usage issue. So now, getting back to warnings, the warnings that you find in the dictionary come from these words that we label non-standard. And non-standard is the true linguist's term, not conforming in pronunciation, grammatical construction, idiom, or word choice to the usage generally characteristic of educated native speakers of a language. Educated native speakers of a language. So that means educated speakers of a language must have the opposite, that is to say, standard usage. And so there is such a thing as standard English. That's what I'm using right now. It's what we typically use internationally to communicate. It's what people use in, obviously, academic settings and in professional settings. And it's important to remember for all of us that standard English is not a superior form of the language, but it is a privileged form of the language. And what does that privilege mean? That privilege has to do with academic success, professional success, international communication. And so there are many different ways that we can communicate. Many and most of us speak in different registers throughout any given day. We might have a different kind of way of speaking at home, or to your partner, or to your children, or to the people from your home region, for example. Compared with the way that you speak professionally, the way that you speak in a business meeting or when you're giving a webinar. And so it's important to remember that the dictionary distinction between standard and non-standard is just that. It's making this division between what educated native speakers of a language prefer and everyone else, and that includes almost everyone else, at different moments, at different times, will have a different, perhaps a dialectal way of speaking. So it's just important to recognize what standard and non-standard mean. And this is what I mean. This is getting to this idea of manners. Usage is the manners of language. And manners are not linguistic. Manners are extra-linguistic. Manners refer to culture. They refer to education. They refer to religion, or your age, your generation, or prejudice. That could be linguistic prejudice. It could be prejudice for a certain kind of food. Prestige, and again, that gets to this idea of standard English, which is the prestige dialect. And finally, to taste, something else, which is a particular thing. Our taste is formed individually. By our experiences, by our acquaintances, by our family, by our region. But let's just look at this list again. Culture is obviously a huge sort of umbrella term that includes language. Education often is a way of refining your presentation, your linguistic presentation. You learn how to write better, write more clearly, write more grammatically. And also what that can cause, though, is a way to judge others by their perceived education, whether someone has as much as you, or doesn't write as well as you, or doesn't spell as well as you do. Region is a big one. Region has to do with often dialectal accents. I do have a regional accent, which you may not perceive. I think partly because unconsciously, as a professional who works in American English, very extreme regional accents tend to fade as people go through the educational system. And in my case, I think it happened when I was in college, that I slowly reduced, without knowing it, the extent to which my regional accent appeared. And if you're curious, I'm from the Boston area. My own family speaks with a very heavy Boston accent, and I love regional accents. I love my home accent. I love all regional accents in English. And so what would that sound like? My father might say, instead of the famous sentence, "Park the car in Harvard Yard," and with the classic American R's, the Boston accent is typically non-rhotic. Non-rhotic means not R producing. And so my father would say, "Park the car in Harvard Yard." And that's just a wonderful, charming thing. If you know your American history, you might remember President Kennedy, who was from Boston. He had that way of speaking as well. And so when you see movies, you might hear a Western accent, a Southern accent, a New York accent, a Boston accent. That's what region means. And it's important to distinguish those regional characteristics from the more important structural features of a language, which have to do with, again, grammar and syntax and usage. And so we have to, I think the more sophisticated we are, the more able we are to hear those things for what they are, which is personality. And they reflect a person's background and not necessarily a person's education or lack of it, which is often where prejudice comes in. And that's another part of our list here. Generation is interesting. I mean, it must be true in Brazil also, that there are certain names. For example, my grandmother's had first names that basically don't exist anymore, that none of my contemporaries have. Old-fashioned names, old-fashioned phrases, old-fashioned swear words. And so because the only constant of language is change, we see that these things change too. Prestige is something we've already talked about that has to do with education, and this idea of standard English. And finally, taste. Let's talk about taste a little bit. This just happened a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to put a couple of tweets on the screen. Twitter is a wonderful place for language discussion. And if you don't follow English language, if you're on Twitter, and you can follow some fun linguistic people on Twitter, and also entities like Merriam-Webster has a nice Twitter feed for the Principal Dictionary, and we also have a special feed for the ESL Dictionary, for our Learners Dictionary. And I think that Twitter handle is MW for Learners. It's a wonderful Twitter feed about teaching and learning English. But in this case, I think this is a political journalist who wrote, "You can grow a tree or grow a tomato, but not a pie or the economy. As a transitive verb, it means to cultivate, not to expand or fabricate. The image of the economy as an organic thing is a major right-wing libertarian trope, so my objection is ideological as well as grammatical." So we see here a kind of a political argument that's presented in grammatical terms. And I responded to this person, and I wrote, first of all, you should look up the word in the dictionary. There's a good usage note at the entry. Transitive use is established and grammatical, but one's taste can determine whether or not to use it. It also sounds jargony to me, for what it's worth, but taste and grammar are different things. Taste and grammar are different things. So if we look at, if we think about what we really mean by taste, that's always an individual thing. And again, it can have to do with your age, your experience, your region, your generation, there's a million things. These are all extra linguistic things. So again, your sophistication as an English language lover, as an English language teacher, includes recognizing those things that have to do with taste and are extra linguistic, like manners, like culture, like prestige, like prejudice, and those things that are linguistic. This is a funny example. Match.com is a dating website where people go to find a new boyfriend or girlfriend. And they had a survey a couple of years ago about what is desirable for a new boyfriend or girlfriend. And you can see at the top the 10 things that men judge women most on. Number 1 is teeth, and number 2 is grammar. And the same is true for women. Number 1 is teeth by a much larger percentage, 71%, and number 2 is grammar. And there's an American comedian who made a joke when this came out. He said, this news about teeth and grammar is very good news for those of us whom have both. That is to say, who have both good teeth and good grammar. Now you can see here when they use the word grammar, I think this is an important point for us as professionals, as English language lovers, English language teachers. When they say grammar here, I don't think they really mean grammar. I think they mean all things linguistic, pronunciation, spelling, all these other elements. I don't think they just mean what a linguist would call grammar. But this proves that my point, which is to say that manners and usage are often extra linguistic, that they are social. And what could be more social than looking for a new boyfriend or girlfriend? One of the most difficult usage problems in American English is this one. And again, you for the most part, if you are a person who has learned English to fluency, especially from a Romance language, you don't have this problem. But in American English and native speakers of English often confuse these two words. I pronounce them differently, affect and effect, just so that we can hear the difference. And you should all know that the confusion is that they are pronounced the same way with a schwa in the first syllable, affect. And also they're both nouns and they're both verbs, and that's really a really confusing thing. So if you get business correspondence, written correspondence as a professional in the United States, you will often see these words used in incorrect ways, that is to say, exchanged for each other. The shorthand, by the way, as a matter of teaching, I would recommend that you can see that affect with an A is much more commonly used as a verb, and effect with an E is much more commonly used as a noun. The noun affect refers to a psychological expression of your face. It's related to affection or affectivity, and affection, which connects to emotion. So a psychologist might say his face showed no affect, and that means no expression. And that's the way affect is used as a noun. It's a very specific and not very common usage. So I would recommend teaching affect as a verb initially. And effect is used as a noun overwhelmingly, but it can be a verb, a transitive verb. So to effect change is typically the idiom that you see it with. So it's interesting to think of this as being a usage issue, and also again shows you how really devastatingly awful English is, because these are two words that obviously developed from the same Latin roots and that came to mean very slightly but also slightly overlapping things, and then became both nouns and both verbs. So English is awful. Now let's look at some of these examples, and here's the one we just talked about. This text that you see on the screen and the next several slides are all word for word from our dictionary for learning for learners of English, for non-native speakers. We call it Merriam-Webster's Advanced Learners English Dictionary. This dictionary is online for free at learnersdictionary.com. Learnersdictionary.com. So you can go there and you will see these exact same examples. So we make a note, we put it in a box and say, do not confuse affect and effect. In this case, we already went through this. I won't go through this again. Let's move on to the next slide. But think of these interesting English words that are so close and yet mean different things. So for example, the verbs clean and cleanse both mean very similar things. They have semantic overlap, but they're used very differently. Almost no native speaker of English would use them interchangeably. So you cleanse your skin. Cleanse is usually referred to making the body or parts of the body clean, whereas clean is more common than cleanse and less specific. And so you know, that's a very important little usage note. Clothing and clothes. That's a fascinating one. Again, semantically, they are nearly identical, and yet no native speaker of English would ever use them in the same exact place. So clothing tends to be used discussing a particular type of clothes or talking about clothing in general. This shop sells vintage clothing. But clothes is used when you're talking about what you're actually wearing. I need to put on some clean clothes. I put on some nice clothes today. We have these interesting registers that we can label in the dictionary. So like, for example, I'm sure you're all familiar with this sort of spoken use of like that's very informal. And it's often used in informal speech, and you hear it in the way young people speak. So as we can see in very informal speech in American English, it's used with the verb to be, this sort of expression of quoting. The quotative like is what this is called. I was like, are you sure you want to do this? And she was like, yeah, why not? And then you see that we put a literal translation, a gloss, an explanation in the brackets, so that the idea of this dictionary, this kind of dictionary, is that you and your students can use it on your own. That is to say that your students can use this, and there will be an explanation right there given in the dictionary definition for this usage. Whom is kind of the other side of the coin. It's a little bit more formal. So whereas like is a kind of informal use, whom is a kind of formal use. And you may have perceived, as many people have, that whom seems to be being used less and less frequently over the years, and yet it still persists in certain constructions. And so we label these as formal and less formal. So to whom did you speak? Whom did you speak to? But much more commonly, who did you speak to? Now, you've probably all encountered this, and you may have wondered about this, and I think this has to do with something very elemental to the way that a native speaker of English is wired. That we very desperately want, because of the way English syntax works, we want the first noun of a sentence to be the subject of that sentence. even when it isn't. So in this case, whom are you speaking to? The subject of the sentence is you. Who are you speaking to? Whom are you speaking to? Whom is the object. The object is obviously whom. The object form is whom. Who is the subject form. And yet, when the object of a sentence in English comes at the beginning of the sentence, we very often use the subjective case. It's simply usage where I'm simply telling you the habits of a language. Who did you speak to? That is really what most people use. So you'll see the other examples there that go through this. And I would point out that in teaching whom, remember that it is the object case, and that when it's the object not of a verb but of a preposition, it's actually pretty clearly used as whom, especially when that preposition is at the end of a sentence, or I'm sorry, no matter where the preposition occurs. So, for example, you can just listen for your ear and teach it this way to get the habit. For whom, for whom, for whom. By whom, by whom, by whom. With whom, with whom, with whom. At whom, at whom, at whom. The whom form, the object form, follows the preposition. And those are cases in which more people do still use whom. Now, there are other questions of sensitivity. So this is extra linguistic, this is cultural. The term Native American is most often used. We don't use American Indian so much anymore, and the term Indian itself is also still used, but it can be considered offensive. So there you have a nice little paragraph that explains to you that there is some important information that is cultural to know about how to use these terms. Dead and deceased, and this is an interesting one because it expresses many different cases in the English language. And that is to say, the words that descended from the Anglo-Saxon Old English roots of English with their parallel words that descended from mostly the Old French of the Norman conquerors that itself was descended from Latin. So here we have dead and deceased. Dead is the Anglo-Saxon, the Old English word. Deceased is obviously the Latin word. They mean the same thing. And yet they're never used the same way. And so you would say in a more polite context, the word deceased. My mother is deceased. To say dead, it would be too aggressive. It would be too, almost too emotional, too on the nose. Think of all the emotional household words of English. The words for members of the family, the words for parts of the body, but also all the swear words in English. Those are all the Old English Germanic words, these emotional terms. Also, just think of a basic word like girl as opposed to female. And notice there's a distancing effect between the Germanic, the Old English word and the Latin word, and that's always true. The Latin term, like female, you could identify people like, as the police might say, a female suspect. But if you have a daughter, you would say she's my darling girl. And so the words that are home words, that are emotional, closer to your heart, they are always the Anglo-Saxon words. The Latin words, the French-based words are always the more medical, the more legal, the more governmental, the more technical, the more emotionally distant words. And that happens time and time again. And it's an amazing sort of historical circumstance that because of the fact that one group of people conquered another, back in 1066 when the Normans conquered England, the circumstance was quite simply that the French won and they became the governing body, so that the laws of England in the Middle Ages were set by people who spoke French. And that is why all the legal terms in English are French words. So think of words like judge and jury and indictment and arraignment. They're all French words. And in fact, this is true. There's a great famous example also about food terms. So if we think of the animals that provide food that are on the farm and the food itself, it's unusual in English that there are often different words. So for example, pig is English, but pork is French. Sheep is English, but mutton is French. Cow is English, but beef is French. Deer is English, but venison is French. So in every single case, the animal as it's alive and in the farmyard is the Anglo-Saxon English word, but the prepared food is the French word. And this shows you, embedded in the context of our language, a very clear social context of who was serving whom. In other words, the conquerors were being served by those who were conquered. And that is embedded in our language to this very day. And that's, I think, a beautiful example of how these social contexts create linguistic results. So other ways of expressing extra linguistic qualities that are shown in the dictionary has to do with tone. So, for example, you can say, "What's the matter?" And that's a very sympathetic question. You look sad. What's the matter? But if you were to say, "What's the matter with you?" That's a very unsympathetic question. So you can see in this kind of usage note, we make that clear that this word matter can tip in either direction depending on the context. Again, more synonyms: lean, thin, and skinny. They are almost synonyms, and yet they're never used the same way. I'm going to move quickly through this, but you can look at these slides or look at these entries in the dictionary afterwards if you like. Bring and take. This is a constant controversy in English. You know, I brought you some flowers. Can I take the, you know, one has to do with coming toward and one has to do with moving away. Again, it's not really the way the semantics work, but it is the way the usage is often used. And there's this emphatic so. That apple pie tasted so good. It's very hard to define a word like that. It's simply an intensifier. We have words like this, nah, you know, a very informal word. It's not written, it's not printed very frequently, but we add these words to the dictionary because it's quite commonly used. And we mark it, it's a very informal term. So that label is very important. We label words formal, informal, offensive, rad. The party was totally rad. Kisser, and this is an interesting word because this is a word that is old-fashioned. If you watch old movies, black and white movies from the 1930s and 40s, you'll see that sentence, punch him right in the kisser, meaning the mouth. And yet in modern English, contemporary English, it's transparent, kisser is one who kisses. So this is a word that has a different usage according to time and generation and not according just to manners. Jack. You don't know Jack. And again, this one gives you this offensive sense where it modifies an even more offensive term. So this is the kind of information that a dictionary can give you. And this is why a dictionary isn't just the definitions. You'll notice we didn't talk really at all about definitions today. I could give you a whole lecture just about dictionary definitions because that's really the heart of what a dictionary is. That's what most of the dictionary entries contain. But there's this second piece. I think a dictionary entry contains two kinds of facts. The linguistic fact is the definition, but more than that, more basic than that, what is a linguistic fact? The spelling, the conventional spelling of a word, the phonetics, the conventional pronunciation of a word, the stress, especially with English, the conventional stress patterns of a word, then the definition and its etymology. These are all linguistic facts. We can report these facts. The second kind of fact in the dictionary definition is what I would call the cultural or social facts. These are the usage notes in a dictionary. And these things have to do not with the meaning of the word, but where its appropriateness lies. And we as English language teachers, English language lovers, can't keep our heads in the sand and ignore these things. We have to address them. We have to recognize that some of these words have embedded controversies in them. Some of these words may be delicate or offensive when you use them. And isn't it better to know about this offensiveness as a user, as a teacher, as a speaker, as a learner, before you offend somebody? And that's why it's important when you look at a dictionary, when you test a dictionary, to look up the most offensive words you can think of. Look at those entries. Look at the F word in our Learner's Dictionary. It is an absolutely marvelous description of that word because it has to be explained very carefully for people in order to understand its complete offensiveness. Dictionaries, you know, traditionally, and especially at Merriam-Webster, we don't believe in any kind of censorship. We put all those words in the dictionary in order to report factually on their usage. So we can't bury our heads in the sand. We have to acknowledge that these words exist and then report accurately on them. The famous editor of Merriam-Webster's Unabridged Dictionary of 1961, he used to say, tell the truth about words. And that's really what we're talking about. Just tell the truth. We're trying to report the facts. And this is finally my little, my favorite thing. My favorite philosopher is Montaigne. This is the French philosopher Montaigne. He lived at the same time as Shakespeare, and he invented the form of the essay, the literary essay. And the essay means writing a personal response, a personal opinion, a personal idea. And he has this wonderful sentence in the essays: they who would fight custom with grammar are fools. And keep in mind that idea of custom and manners. And habits. That is what usage is. That is what usage is. Grammar is something else. Grammar is a fixed set of rules, and custom and usage shift and alter over time. And finally, we are done, I think, just on time. I'm pretty good. I'm just about on time, and I would love to answer your questions. I can see some of your questions on the screen. And I'm not sure if I can hear you, but maybe I can hear you too. But I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. And thank you for listening. And thank you for your responses. All right. Right. How much must a grammatical error be used in order to be accepted as a new correct form? This is a fantastic question. How much, you know, it's really true that there are words that, and I'm sure the same is true in Portuguese, there are words that migrate from one meaning to another. And at times, it can be forgotten what the word originally meant because the new meaning has taken over. But you'll notice in the dictionary, we usually leave traces. They're usually the evidence of the previous usage of a word. There's a word, for example, peruse. Peruse is a word that we use to mean to glance, to examine, but to just look at something briefly. But originally it meant to examine with thorough care. So that word went to meaning look, to read or look at something with thorough care, and now it means to look at something very superficially. And that took probably 100, 150 years for that word to switch over. And so the simple answer is it has to be overwhelming. It really has a new form, a new correct form has to be used in many places by many people in many publications over a long period of time. So the fact is, it's not easy to do. It's not easy to change a language. Languages certainly do follow rules, but they don't follow orders. So language kind of has its own way of developing. It will grow and move on its own schedule. Some words change quickly. So for example, the words that we connect with computer technology that had other uses before, words like mouse or lurk or browse or cookie, these are all words that have new meanings that are accepted and used every day, in addition to their old meanings. I mean, obviously the word mouse for a computer mouse has not replaced the word mouse, meaning the little furry animal. Happily, the word cookie for a computer program has not replaced the word cookie, meaning the sweet baked good. But there are other ones that are slightly more controversial and more subtle. So for example, access. Access as a verb just 20 years ago was not accepted by many publications. They would have said access is a noun and only a noun. But as the linguist David Crystal, you may have heard of David Crystal. You should look him up. You should Google him. His books are wonderful. As David Crystal has said, frequency breeds content. And what he means by that is that more you hear something, the more correct it sounds. And so access is, as a verb, meaning to gain access to internet connectivity, is something I probably hear every day, maybe 5 times a day. And so that's a verb and a completely normal standard verb in English today, but it wasn't 20, 25 years ago. So we see in the space of one generation that a word can go from a word that an English professor would have deemed incorrect to a word that an English professor will use him or herself today. And so you do see every word has its own pace, but in the case of access, I think you can actually trace it in the space of about 25 years. And it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, the way that language is always changing. So thank you for your question. And I'm going to see if I can see some more. Yes, as a native speaker of Portuguese, you usually use the Latin-rooted words such as cemetery instead of graveyard. Yes, and that's a good question. That's a good question. Cemetery and graveyard. You know, some people insist that there is a usage distinction between those two words. They obviously are synonyms, but often people say graveyard refers to that which is adjacent to a church or on a church property, as opposed to cemetery, which would be separate from a church or church property. So these are distinctions, again, very subtle distinctions in usage that people talk about. But if you use only the Latin-based words in fluent English, ultimately you will sound a little bit strange. Of course you will. You'll sound just a little bit formal and a little bit technical. And maybe a little bit emotionally distant, because those words, as I said, always kind of push the emotion away from the speaker. So it is good. It's a good thing to think about those Old English rooted words as well. It doesn't mean that you have to be too conscious, I don't think, of using, in this case, cemetery, graveyard is not a big deal. But in the other cases, you know, think of words like, you know, we have ask. Ask is the old German word, old Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Old English word, ask. And then demand, which is French, and then request, and then interrogate. You know, so you wouldn't go to say, when you're a tourist, you wouldn't say, I would like to interrogate that restaurant to see if we can have dinner there tonight. Interrogate is the Latin-based word, but it's much, much too specific and formal and technical and legal to use in that context. So for the more broad general contexts, the home contexts, you would use ask, the Old English word, and not interrogate the Latin-based word. So that's a really good question, and I think that really the answer is best shown by your own experience and your own ear. In other words, the more you're exposed to native speech, watch movies, listen to podcasts, you know, listen to the news on American radio. I think National Public Radio for American news is terrific, partly because they have such engaging presenters, and you can listen. You can listen to their podcasts. That'd be a great way to hear a lot of great American English accents. So that's my advice would be to simply be aware that there is this distinction between the Latin and the Old English, and if you're aware of it, you're already kind of on the path to making those distinctions yourself. How do I handle usage with children and teens when they're exposed to so much media outside of school? This is, I'm sure, the same question that teachers have for native speakers in Portuguese in Brazil and native speakers in classrooms in the United States for American kids. And that is that, first of all, you have to give a good example and show good examples and teach good examples, and also make it clear when if inappropriate language is used and it's not conscious. In other words, there's no meaning, there's no intention for offending, it's simply an improper usage, to correct it in a way that isn't embarrassing, you know, to make it about the language and not about the person. Notice our labels in the dictionary. We are labeling the words, we're not labeling the users, right? That's a huge change in dictionaries. Our old dictionaries, you can see behind me the old dictionaries on the bookshelves. Some of those old dictionaries had labels that instead of non-standard, there was one label that said illiterate. Now, illiterate is actually a judgment about the user. It's labeling the person, not labeling the word, right? And so I'm proud to say that our dictionaries are more technical today, and we say non-standard or offensive or obscene, and that can give you a finer gradation, or informal. A finer gradation, a more clear and concise depiction of where that word exists on the spectrum of formality in language. And so I would say correcting the usage of students has to be about the words, and just make sure that they understand you, that you're talking about the word, you're not talking about them. And that you're not a bad person because you used a bad word. Let's address the idea that this word may cause offense to other people, and that we don't want to do that with language. We want to use language in ways that do not cause offense. And that's a fascinating question, and honestly, it's something that you will probably evolve your own answer to for all of us as educators. All right, any other questions? And so much media. Yeah, okay. Something that bothers me is if she was as opposed to if she were. Grammar's telling me the second one is the proper way. Right. You often hear that it's if I were a rich man, that construction of the verb to be, the subjunctive. It's relatively rare in English. It is more formal in sound. So if I was a rich man, if I were a rich man, they're both understood by everybody. But it is true, as you point out, that in professional writing, in academic writing, in good journalism, those kinds of predications in which the outcome is unknown are usually given in the subjunctive voice. And so that if I were is correct. So you're right about that. But you're also right to observe that that is frequently not the way that people speak in fluent, informal, conversational English. And that's simply a fact of life. There are registers of English that have to do with academic, formal tone, and registers of English that are somewhat less formal. So again, this is kind of advanced. I would say, as with the whom example, teach it correctly. Teach the usage as you know it to be correct. But you might want to also add that that there is this other way that you will hear that is also common, but probably not recommended for academic and professional success. So that's, again, this has to do with the manners and appropriateness. But that's an excellent question. And again, just the fact that you are aware of that distinction, if she was, if she were, shows to me that you are already projecting the right thing to your students, that you are able to express that there are these two things, they are slightly different, and if you can explain them, then you're a good teacher. So good for you. Let's see. Oh, there's more. Let's see. I'm going back down to read your questions. Yes, the internet is changing the meaning of some words through memes like shade. That's right. Are these linguistic movements being considered? Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, shade, that's an excellent example. Shade, I don't know if that new usage of shade is in our dictionary yet. I think it is, but I'd have to go look. But absolutely, basically, the way that we communicate with language is the same. We still use language to communicate with other people. And think about this, with social media, much more of our communication is in written form than in spoken form. So that's one thing that's important. That means that things like spelling, for example, really do count. We see in our dictionary data that when people misspell a word, for example, when a famous person misspells a word, or a prominent politician misspells a word, then they are often lampooned. People make fun of them for misspelling the word. In other words, we judge people by their ability to spell, because Twitter and Facebook are written mediums. They are forms in which language is mostly read and not heard. And so what's interesting to me is that provides us as dictionary editors, as lexicographers, lots of new evidence. And so new usages like shade spread faster. That's all. Our communication is faster, and therefore the spread of language change is faster. But nevertheless, we process language in the same way. We judge language in the same way. We do feel that spelling still counts, even though, as we've already talked about today, spelling in English is not only not phonetic, it's not logical, and yet we do judge each other. And think about this as a simple matter of prejudice. Which is to say that spelling perfectly in English, really all it conveys to another reader is that you have mastered those weird, arcane, difficult, non-phonetic and non-logical conventions of English spelling. That's all they do. They basically say, I am part of the club that you are, the club that knows how to spell this word. And that itself is a form of snobbery or prejudice. And yet again, convention is all we have. Language, words are sometimes all we have. And so in order to communicate clearly and to not have the distraction of people criticizing you and misspelling words, to use the tool correctly, we need to spell correctly. But absolutely, words like shade, we are watching, and they will go into the dictionary. If that one isn't in yet, it will be very, very shortly. But anyway, thank you. We're just about done with our time, and I'm thrilled to have had this time with you. I hope to see you in July at Southern Cone TESOL. And come by and say hello at that time, and I'll be giving a talk on usage, a little bit similar to this with some different parts, different elements. And one thing I will be doing as well is discussing our online dictionary and the way that people look up words, which words people look up and when they look them up. Because we now know as dictionary makers how dictionary users actually use dictionaries. And I think that's very important for teachers to know. So I'm going to begin that talk in July with a short explanation of how the dictionary is used by the general public. And then we'll get into very specific things about idioms and usage, much like we did today. So hey, thanks so much for all of your time and attention. And again, I hope to see you in July.